joined today by Paul DeBaggis, a retired member of the Franklin Selectmen, the Town Council, the Planning Board, and also still active today as a building inspector throughout the state. So Paul has had a very varied career through the years and is a true expert on all things Franklin, and we're really glad to have him here today. So Paul, thanks for coming on the program.
I'm happy to be here, Eamon. I've been thinking about it, and the true expert, of course, would probably be Jim Johnston.
Yes.
who's the historian's historian, to my way of thinking. Incidentally, Jim and I are the only two remaining selectmen left who served on the Franklin Board of Selectmen, which went out like about 40 years ago. We've had a council form of government now for about 40 years.
And Franklin's kind of unique in that way because most of the surrounding towns around us continue to have Board of Selectmen and open town meeting, which is kind of the old New England tradition back to colonial times.
That's correct. That's correct. And I read the other day somewhere that as of the moment, there are only 13 municipalities in Massachusetts that have adopted the council form of government.
Wow.
So there are still over 300 to go. And when the council came to Franklin, the people who really, I was not a big council supporter, wasn't big against it either. I just couldn't get as excited about it as some people were. But they were saying, oh, this is the wave of the future. This is the wave of the future. But if you take the number of towns that had a council 40 years ago and add the number of towns that have a council now, it would take approximately 3,000 years for the entire state to have a council. So it's not happening as fast as some people might like, but it is a wave of the future, and I see the advantages to it. Coming up, and you as a councilor would know, I've been up to a few meetings and dealing with you people. It's a lot more centralized, and things happen a lot faster and more with less trouble and less difficulty.
So by around the time we colonize the Andromeda Galaxy, we should have all of Massachusetts switched over to to council systems.
That will work.
Now, tell me a little bit about growing up in Franklin. You're obviously a native of the community, and you've lived here all your life.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, I've lived here all my life. I was born in Milford Hospital, lived in Franklin all my life. In fact, I've pretty much lived on the same street all my life. And eventually married a girl who lived 4 houses from me. So I'm still married to the same lady, and she's still wonderful. But yeah, things have changed so dramatically. I was telling you earlier before the show how in the 1950s when we'd come home from high school, the big thing in town was go down to the pool room, which was beneath the old Morse Theater, which was on Main Street. Currently, there's a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, I guess I think it was an Indian restaurant there, but it just went out of business, Sterling Grill, and then probably some other restaurant will come in there forthwith.
So that used to be the pool room, and at one point before, I'm not sure if it was before or after, I think you nailed it though, when you said the police department used to be there. I think the police department was underneath the theater before the pool room, but then it became the pool room, and all the guys would go down there and shoot pool and talk about the day and see what's going on, and that's pretty much how things went. Franklin was much smaller. When I got out of high school, there were about 7,500 people in Franklin.
Wow, as compared to almost 35,000 now.
Yes,
by most of the current projections. We haven't gotten quite to the 2020 census yet, but we'll find out just how many more people than that it really is these days.
Massive, massive changes, and for the most part, for the better. Of course, Franklin, as you know, has full access to municipal sewers. It has the MBTA. It's right on Route 495. It's almost, we used to say equidistant, but it's almost equidistant from Worcester, Boston, and Providence. So
sort of a Goldilocks zone in some ways.
It's a central place, and a lot of people like it, and a lot of people want to be here, and the availability of the railroad and the sewers and everything make it an available, desirable place to live. And So things have really dramatically changed.
What do you see as some of the biggest changes that have happened since you graduated high school, and some of the positive changes? Obviously, we have a new train station as of 1988, so not that new, but we've had 30 years with the Forge Park Station, the addition of the South Franklin Industrial Park, Forge Park, and all kinds of other industrial buildings and things like that, plus a sort of regrowth of the downtown after it got quieter for a number of years.
Toward the end of my Franklin career, which I culminated my service in Franklin as a building commissioner in 1987. Toward the end there, probably 85 or 84 to 86, somewhere in there, the town administrator, Paul Shue, asked myself, Pete Brunelli, the former treasurer collector, and Dick Morey, the former town comptroller, if we would work with the people from Forge Park and do a development agreement. And one of the parts of the agreement was the MBTA station. So I'm a little familiar with that, and I kind of know how long it's been out there and all that kind of good stuff. I like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a couple of minutes, and one thing I'd like to describe is what the town of, what the street of West Central Street, what it looked like 55 years ago. It works in my mind. I don't know if it's going to work verbally, but we'll give it a try. If you start at the railroad bridge downtown, head out East Central Street, the first thing you will notice is on the left, right against the tracks, there's a parking lot. Well, many, many years ago, there was an old gasoline station there. And the next one would be Ferrara's Market in that little plaza. And before that was, I believe, a used car repair place. And across the street where the Black Box Theater is, that was once a stately Victorian-style home owned by Lorraine Metcalf, who was a former teacher in the Franklin school system. And next to Lorraine was the Franklin Lumberyard. So all of those drive-in windows for the Rockland Trust and the next building, that was all lumberyard, and stacks of lumber and plywood and all that good stuff was there. And then there's the Keefe Insurance Agency, the Cataldo, and of course now where the little plaza is used to be the old municipal building. The Dean Dormitory further down on the left is brand new. That's, I think, less than 10 years old, would you say?
The one, oh yes, the one that used to be where there was sort of some like volleyball courts and badminton courts and things like that. Yeah, I think that was torn down probably in 2010 perhaps.
Just before the Davis Thayer School there. Davis Thayer used to be the high school. And then going down in the next couple of blocks, things have pretty much stayed the same. I think it's probably because of the zoning. Most of that is zone residential. And the next big change would be when you get down to Beaver Street. And after Beaver Street, kind of like all hell breaks loose as far as new development. You've got Edmund's Gift Shop and all those stores down in that little plaza. The Rockland Trust has a little bank there. And there are stores and stores and stores. And at one point, 50 years ago, that whole area from Beaver Street all the way up past where 495 is today was nothing but residential on both sides of the street.
And even farm fields. I've seen photos, I think, from 1975 or
Old
76.
farms, fields.
Where, probably where the Burger King is currently, roughly that area.
Yes.
Where there was a farm there, a huge farm, like basically like one barn building standing in the mid-70s, and now it looks nothing like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then going up further, getting real close to 495, where the Stop and Shop Plaza is, that was once DePoto's nursery before he moved up to Washington Street on the curve. DePoto had his nursery there, and
Which is currently called Hillside Nursery.
Hillside Nursery, plants and all that kind of good stuff. Then the next thing that is different, there was no 495. And the next major change is after 495, when you go over 495, you can take a right and go down to 99 Restaurant and BJ's.
Right.
On that wicked curvy road that goes around left and right and right and left and back up to the railroad siding. That was the old Route 140, and that was the only, there was no straight shot to Bellingham like there is today. That went in probably 16, 18 years ago.
Probably,
maybe?
I think
20.
it's named after Shane Cabino, one of the 2 Franklin residents that was killed in Iraq. His life was lost in combat in 2004, I believe. So I think it's sometime after that, maybe 2006 or thereabouts, that breach was put in.
Okay.
If I'm putting my math together right.
Yeah, it's a good dozen years. You're right. And then the next major thing, of course, now that on the left is a big industrial park, but it's somewhat hidden from Route 140. But on the right, Gorelick's farm used to be a farm. In the front, there was a big old house, and when I say a big old house, this was a wood frame, clapboarded building that probably housed 6 or 8 families. And the only other thing there besides the big old house and the 8 families were a bunch of cows.
And I think as recently as like 1998 or something like that, there were still cows occasionally sort of garrisoned out in that field every once in a while.
If you go by today, it's nothing like that. I was by yesterday, and I have silos on my brain. I was counting silos as kind of a zoning thing that I might talk about at some point in time, and I think there are 15 real tall, large silos there now. But in the old days, there was one little hay silo and all these cows.
A very interesting note about Gerlich Farms, actually. I guess sort of the understanding I have of Gerlich Farms' history is that it was originally the Ray family's big sort of model dairy farm in the early 20th century, and they ended up selling it to the Gerlich family, probably early 1930s, who really kind of took it and ran with it, turned it into like a big sort of dairy processing and distribution place. And Gerlich Farms now, which I think is a subsidiary of Dean Foods or something like that, has had a tremendous growth in the past 20 years or so. They have a lot of the milk distribution for like the Albany area, greater Boston area. But curiously, I've heard actually from our soon-to-be town administrator, Jamie Helen, one of the things that's really changed recently is they've closed their big plant in Lynn and sold off 13 acres on the waterfront for probably one of the best cash grabs in the entire Boston real estate market these days, and relocated all their employees to Lynn. So they've consolidated a lot of their operations to Franklin, which is good news for Franklin water customers because they apparently foot about 30% of the bill for water with their tremendous water usage every single day. So very interesting with that.
Gorelick has always been a real good neighbor to the town, in my view. And I think Alan Vernon is still running it. Alan's mom was a Gorelick. And that's his point of entry. And Alan was a great guy and remains a great guy. I watched a Pats game this fall, and they showed Mr. Kraft in his booth, and there's Alan Vernon sitting with him. You know. So. But so that was the Gorelick thing, it's a massive change. And going further down to the Bellingham line, where everything gets another wow kind of thing. Everything's popping up everywhere. There was nothing. Maybe a small family restaurant, and that was it.
And even that's actually very, very recent, though, that change at I guess you could call it the other Four Corners to distinguish it from the Four Corners where King Street and East Central Street join in downtown Franklin. But I know people in Bellingham area call it the Four Corners as well. But that particular road junction between 140 and Prospect Street or whatever it is, that is a really interesting spot because that was all fields until just the past 5 or 10 years when they've really ramped it up with a lot of new restaurants there and gas stations and stuff. Plus that big new apartment complex that went in the past 3 to 4 years.
It's called Westerly, I think.
Westerly or something like that.
Yeah. So that's one street in the town, and granted, that's a street that's probably had a remarkable change. Coming here today, I drove down Cottage Street, and Cottage Street looks, until you get down to Agway, Cottage Street looks exactly how it looked 50 or 60 years ago. There's been very little change, but more of Franklin is on the West Central Street model than the Cottage Street model. Some of the old neighborhoods are pretty much left alone.
And what must have been very interesting for you when you were a kid or a teenager in Franklin is particularly in the 50s, early 60s, so much of the town was still farmland, which very, very little of it is anymore. We have a few farms and now an agricultural commission, which is a really great thing for kind of investing in community agriculture, but it's definitely a small crew of people these days that have any sort of farms or horse stables or anything like that in Franklin anymore, compared to probably what the situation was like when you were growing up.
Yes, sir. And then I recall also, not too recent, but not the early days either. A gentleman named Jack D'Elia had some farmland down at the end of Elm Street, went right up against the town line in Medway. And there was like 40 to 60 acres, and that all ended up getting some kind of a farm restriction, and the trustees of reservations got involved, and that was able to be saved for the town.
That's great.
So yeah, you're right though. Franklin was a farming community, and it was known when Benjamin Franklin sent the books to the town library. They had asked him for a bell, and you must have heard this story from 5 different ways. But my way is and it doesn't mean my way is any better or any worse than anyone else's. It's the way I read it and the way I've heard it, and that is that. Franklin was asked to donate a bell, and we've named the town after you, and isn't that wonderful, and would you give us a bell? And he said, I've thought it over, to the Franklin residents, I've thought it over, and you are all poor farmers, and you couldn't afford the cost of having a bell ringer, so I decided to give you 112 books instead. So, so yeah, it definitely was a farming community.
Well, I guess that's smart enough message. You know, Franklin definitely took that to heart. We had people like Horace Mann certainly embrace that. Self-taught people in this town. Another interesting thing: when did you see really the kind of explosive growth happen in Franklin? When was the to use an overused term right now? When was the inflection point away from being a town of 7,500 people and mills and farms and becoming much more of a commuter town and a suburban place?
Okay. The first so-called spurt happened from 1959 through 1967. And what happened was, in the late 50s, this predates me because I was in high school in the late 50s, but I read about it a lot. In the late 50s, the town wanted to go to urban renewal, and it was going to consist of knocking down everything in the center of town and replacing it with all these brand spanking new buildings. And the town had a big battle over that. At town meeting, it was civil. There was no violence involved, but there was a big civilized battle at the town meeting, and the nays won it over, no urban renewal. So the town realized they had to do something, so they came out with this master plan in 1959. Well, the master plan took a lot of property that had been previously zoned for 10,000-foot lots and wanted to rezone that to 40,000. So landowners all looked into it, and they found out that Massachusetts had and still has, I believe in these days it's an 8-year exemption for land that is on an approved subdivision. In the old days it was 7 years. At one point, it might have even been as low as 5, but I've always known it as 7 years to 8 years. So what happened is all of these big landowners rushed in, and they prepared a preliminary plan. When you do a subdivision in a community, you've got to do 2 plans. A preliminary, which shows the outline, where the road's going, where the lots are, and then a definitive, which shows all the stuff, the curbing, what kind of curbing, is it granite, is it upright, is it vertical, slope granite, how wide is the right-of-way, how wide are the sidewalks. A plan has to be submitted as a preliminary or a definitive, and it gives the applicant the option. So if a person wants to submit a preliminary and it's not a huge engineering cost, he or she can do that. Or you can go say, well, I know they're going to approve this, so I'm going to spend all this money and do the definitive.
Go all in and do every single detail.
Do every little detail. But either way, the law says if you have submitted a definitive or a preliminary plan, you have 7 or 8 years to get it approved and start building on the old zoning.
And who approves that? The planning board here in Franklin?
Planning board, yeah. So what happened is in 1959, when people saw this master plan that was going to take, holy mackerel, I have 4 lots here, 4 10,000-foot lots, and it's going to become 1 lot. People started submitting. So in 1959, I believe at one point I read there were 1,800 house lots proposed.
Wow.
And so from the years 1959 to 1967, there were over 300 homes a year built in Franklin. To me, that was the first and the largest. And I'm going to explain in a minute why I believe it was the largest.
And lots of neighborhoods like Southgate, for instance, off of Pond Street came out of that. Some new houses in the downtown. There's probably many, many other neighborhoods I'm not thinking of, but much of the development along Pond Street, Pleasant Street, Oak Street, all took place during that period of time.
You've got it all, sir. You must have been on the planning board. Good work. You got most of them. Southgate Road is the first one that I would think of. That was known as... was it Parliament Drive, or I forgot what the name of the subdivision was, but it was a biggie. There's over 100 lots on that one only. So anyhow, now all these folks got to have all these approvals. They've got to do something within 7 years. So from 59 to 67, there were 300 building permits a year given out for new homes. I maintain that was the greatest surge in Franklin history. There was a similar surge in the early 90s. It probably went from 88 to 90. It began 88, 90, up until the very late 90s, 96, 97, was 300 homes a year. But the second surge in the 90s was 300 homes based on a population of 16, 18, 20,000. The first surge in 1959 to 67 was a surge based on 300 homes a year with a base population of 8,000.
Wow.
So that's pretty remarkable.
And that must have brought a lot of new people to town, I'm guessing.
It sure did. It sure did. When I ran for planning board in 1966, I decided I have to get into all of these new areas where people don't know me at all. Everybody downtown knew me, and they knew I was a scoundrel anyway. They would never vote for me, which is not quite true, but I like to say it anyway. But anyhow, I felt the need to get into a lot of these new neighborhoods, and that's where I met a whole lot of new people in the town.
And what were you doing at that point in time in 1966 when you ran for planning board in terms of work, and what prompted you to run for planning board?
I ran for planning board because I was interested in politics, and for not much other reason. After I decided to run, though, I found that people were really concerned about all the building. And we found out later, and after I was elected to the planning board, someone said, we need a building code review committee. And I said, what do you need that for? Well, there were homes being built with improper nailing. There were homes being built with the foundation way below the road, and they were getting flooded, and all those kinds of issues. So between 67 and 70, our Building Code Review Committee put forth 40 articles to the town meeting for approval to upgrade the codes, and a lot of them ended up in the zoning bylaw, and they're still there today. So that was a good time for us. We finally got it to where we could manage it, and it seemed to have helped out a whole lot.
And were you already working as a building inspector at that point in time?
No, I wasn't. You asked me that question, and I never did answer it, but I was working on construction. I built multifamily dwellings. I traveled around the state with a company from Boston, and we built housing for the elderly, and we built part of Central Park Terrace.
Oh, yeah. We
did Rentham and Foxborough and a lot of eastern Massachusetts.
This whole Central Park Terrace and the Franklin Housing Authority is a really great piece of work. So many commendations to you and the other folks that worked to build that. It's a great asset for our town. And when was that actually set up, the whole Central Park Terrace there? Was it Franklin Housing Authority to begin with, or did it become that over time?
To the best of my knowledge, it was right from the beginning, because those units were all built under a state housing program. I think the program used to be called 667-1 or -2. But yeah, Franklin has always had that housing authority, and we only did a small part of it. That Central Park Terrace has been built in at least 3 to 4 phases. There are some smaller units there, 1 story, and they have sort of like a pyramid roof.
Yes.
There are 4 units in each of those buildings, where some of the bigger buildings have 6 and 8 and 12 units.
And you worked on some of the bigger buildings sort of toward the back, like closer to King Street?
Yeah, I didn't work that much on the Franklin project for my company, but that was one that they did, actually, before I worked for them.
And so you mentioned this period of time when you joined the planning board. It must have been a really fascinating time to be involved in all of that, especially because in addition to all those building permits being taken out, over 300 a year you're talking about, Franklin also had the construction of 495 going on, which I think started in 61 and maybe ended in the early 70s down in Taunton, or down past Taunton rather, and then way up north near New Hampshire. But that was obviously a construction project that finished in 64, so just before you came on the planning board. And what was that change like? What sort of had been in the path of 495 before that? It's such a part of the geography now, it's hard for many of us to even imagine, there were houses and farms and some stuff there.
I believe it was mostly wooded area or fields. Wooded area or fields. Now, of course, if you approach 495 going west on West Central Street and take a right to head north, the minute you go down to the north, you're going downhill and you can see it's all wetland in through there.
So they must have filled Minebrook Swamp there at some point.
There had to be a lot of filling down in there. And I don't really remember the construction that well. It's kind of like before my time.
And something I've heard about 495, which again is hard to imagine at our present moment in 2019, is that until as recently as the early 1980s, it was practically an untrafficked road by a lot of accounts. Many of us, alive today remember the call boxes that were in place until about 2005 on the side of the road. Pre-cell phone that made a lot of sense, but also because of the remoteness of the road at a lot of points in time, where I've heard people talk about driving on 495 as recently as 1981, 82, and going for an hour without seeing another person on the road.
I can attest to that. I can't say an hour, but I can say that you could sometimes drive several miles without seeing another car. Yeah.
And what really kicked off sort of, I guess in the 60s, to backpedal here for a second, were a lot of those people commuting, or were a lot of them working locally at things like Garlick Farms or the ever-classic Clark Cutler McDermott, which seemed to have employed just about everyone in town at some point? Were most people working locally or commuting to Boston?
I would say more commuting than locally. There wasn't that much business in Franklin in those days. Garelick hadn't even reached the point where they, for a long time, they were the largest employer. We didn't have any industrial parks. Clark Cutler McDermott was kind of heading to phasing outside of things. Many of them worked other locations, and they lived in Franklin. Here's the thing. Franklin is, as I say somewhere in something that I've written, Franklin is about 7 or 8 miles. Franklin was 50 years ago, only 7 or 8 miles further from Boston than Walpole. Today the geography is about the same. So what happens is, if a house was selling for, I checked these prices. This is true. This is a true story. 50 years ago, a house sold for $12,800 in Norwood or Dedham, maybe $12,000 or $11,800 in Walpole. In Franklin, you could buy the house for $9,600. So that's one of the reasons why another reason why Franklin became such a hot commodity.
And that's, I think, sort of true even more recently with the building booms in the 80s and particularly the 90s, where by then, obviously, the prices were much higher with inflation and stuff like that. But even at that point in time, Franklin and Plymouth were both two of the sort of hottest commodities in the state because of a low tax base and pretty cheap housing. In Plymouth's case, I guess, because of the nuclear power plant and all the feedback from that. But here, just because of things like Forge Park, good access to rail and all that kind of stuff. So when you got involved in planning board, you served on planning board for 5 or 6 years?
6 years.
6 years?
I was 66 through the end of 71. It sounds like 5, but it was 6. And the last 3 years I was chairman, and the other guy said, well, he does a good job, so let him keep doing it. And it got to be time consuming. And as you know, when you serve on a board and you have a full-time job, and it can get hectic. So 6 years was, I said, I had a 5-year term and I'm on my second 5-year term. To me, it's the equivalent of two 3-year terms, and I think it's time. So, but it was a real good experience, and it really set me up for my career, actually, which has been in building inspection.
And you didn't actually quit the game at that point, because then you went on to the Board of Selectmen not that long after.
I went on to the Board of Selectmen in 74. and stayed for 2 years. And as I might have mentioned to you earlier, in those days, in 1974 and 75 and 76, up to 79, there was no council, there was no town administrator. The chairman of the Board of Selectmen was the chief executive of the town. I became chairman in 75, and after a couple of meetings, I'm saying, wow, this is something. You know what I'm going to say. And this is something, wow. And one night I went home and I said to my wife, I am the man. And she said, what are you talking about? I said, I'm the man. I'm the chief man in the town. I am it now. Boy, she took me down to my size in a hurry. So I was just plain old Paul. And she said, I don't care what you do with this, all this second job business. You just make sure you keep your first one.
Good advice for all of us in
over
town
the
government.
years, Lauren's been a great sport about my involvement in government.
And so in the mid-'70s, when you were involved with the Board of Selectmen, what sort of things were you folks voting on at that point in time? Obviously, many of these things are perennial, they happen every single year, budgets and stuff like that, but were there particular things that kind of stand out to you as being different than what we're looking at these days?
Two things that I remember distinctly was, one, capping of the landfill. When you use a landfill form of rubbish disposal, at the end of the landfill, you've got to cap it. And that runs into big money, and I think we were all maybe not in such a hurry to cap the landfill. So I recall that from my time on the Board of Selectmen. The other thing I remember was Franklin was not a member of the MBTA. We were what they called a contract community. So every year we were paying $920-something to keep our contract with the MBTA. One year, the advisory board, which was the predecessor to today's FinCom, decided, we've only got 2 riders in the town. Well, we're not going to approve this year. And we had to fight hammer and tong to get that 900. The selectmen fought hammer and tong to get that $966 or whatever.
Seems like not something people would quibble about very much now. Obviously, in the 70s, a lot of things changed in local government, too. I mean, one of the things that I think is probably true to say these days is that while, communities like Franklin still run into budget issues, a lot of things have changed in the sense that town government used to have falling down trucks and stuff like that in a lot of communities. Maybe not Franklin, but many places had rusting out trucks and pretty small staff and meager money to go around. But with the rise of revenue sharing in the mid-'70s, sort of at the state level, that changed a lot of that with state aid and things like that completely altered the financial picture for towns in a lot of ways. You're right, and I don't remember us having really bad equipment, but I can remember when we were small enough that is it the Horseman Museum across the street from the old town hall that Calories developed into a commercial property? That building, the historical building, used to be the town hall, and it housed not only what's in the current municipal building, but also the headquarters for the Department of Public Works. And that's pretty amazing. Did they even have their trucks based there, or did they have them off in a shed someplace else? No, they were down on Beaver Street, down off of Haywood Street. I was going to say that would be a real trick, getting an Oshkosh truck parked in that lot and getting it out during a snowstorm. No, we didn't go that far. Now, another thing that would have been very interesting at that point in time is the creation of the Charles River Pollution Control District, the sewage treatment plant. Yes. Obviously, Franklin was a pretty early mover, probably nationwide, in terms of having water and sewer lines and stuff like that, which go back to 1900 essentially, with the sewer beds that used to be close to the Delcart property and the ones that are now quickly becoming condos off of Pond Street, which were in place, grassed over until just a couple of years ago. Right. But the creation of a true sewage treatment plant as opposed to just an infiltration bed was one of the things that would have happened on your watch with Board of Selectmen, I'm guessing? The Selectmen didn't get really too involved on that one, but I can remember one of the main reasons we had to do that, get into that regional plant, was because of a development known as Redland Park, which is off of Lincoln Street. It's just, if you're heading down Lincoln Street toward Medway, it's just before the Dacey store
on the right. I don't remember the name of that street, but it goes up and in, and there's 120 homes. Well, the whole subdivision was red clay. And some clays are permeable, that is, water will leach through it. Some is not permeable at all, and that was Redland Park. So apparently the perk tests were done at like one of the driest summers in the history of Franklin, and they might have just barely passed, but afterward it was a real mess down there.
And so those houses basically had to get hastily upgraded from septic to
and there was a lot of pressure from that neighborhood, rightly so, to get municipal sewerage, and that kind of helped get us into the regional plan.
And so in the late 70s, obviously, we've touched on this earlier in our talk today, the creation of the new town charter in 1978, and thus the town council, was one of the really big kind of defining things that decade. Who were sort of the proponents of that, and what was the argument at that point in time? Why did Franklin switch, but none of our neighbors?
Some of the reasons why we switched are, number one, it was the third shot at it, and I think some people finally said, well, I voted against this twice and it keeps coming back. I'm going to vote for it this time.
When were the previous two times?
The previous, the year I ran for selectman, which was 74, was the second time. And on that second occasion, it only lost by like 100 votes. The first occasion, which would have been 69, 70, or 71, it lost like a 2-to-1 margin. So first it lost by a 2-to-1 margin, the second time lost by 100 votes. And by the third time, people were getting used to hearing about it and what it was about. And it was a streamlined government, and there was some infighting between selectmen and Public Works Department, which went on for a prolonged time, and people were probably fed up with that. So that's how it came into effect. Originally, the council had 15 members.
That would be a lot of people to have these days.
It was 15 members, and then a few years after it was enacted, I think it was after I left Franklin as the building commissioner in '87. I'm going to guess in the very late '80s, there was a proposal to reduce it from 15 to 7. Some of us thought that was too dramatic a reduction, that you were taking a legislative body, and by reducing it to 7, you were getting nothing more than like a glorified board of selectmen or a glorified school committee, and we kind of opposed the 7, and we ended up with 9, which seems to be a pretty workable number.
Seems like a decent number.
I like it.
And what's interesting about Franklin is that our town council is elected at large, unlike most sort of city and town councils in a lot of places, which are elected sort of with a few people at large and a few people by local district. So it's obviously one of the challenges for us as town councilors is actually getting everyone's issues heard, because there's no one specifically representing, say, Summer Street or something like that.
Exactly. And I believe the original charter and the original council in 1980, 79 or 80, called for 5 at-large councilors and 2 precinct councilors from each precinct. There were 5 precincts then. And then it kept growing in precinct numbers and everything, and we just changed it to 9 at large, which I like.
Yeah, seems to work very well for our community. And so you mentioned that you were building commissioner in the 80s for Franklin. What was that like?
That was a good learning experience for me. I already had quite a bit of experience being on the zoning with the planning board, and I worked building things, and I had actually worked for a while as an assistant building inspector in Franklin. So for me, it was an easy job, a good job, and one that I enjoyed. And it wasn't until I left Franklin in '87 I wanted to learn the writing business, and I had a couple of part-time jobs as as an op-ed writer. I wrote for the Woonsocket Call. That column was called County Beat. And then I ended up, not more than 10 years ago, writing for the Milford News. I had another column that I wrote. And I've done magazine pieces since then. I did a little piece on the library, which got into American Library magazine. And I've had other stuff, building code stuff. But Yeah, originally I started as a building inspector. I enjoyed the town of Franklin. It wasn't really like as busy as it is today, but it was quite busy because a lot of these plans were coming to fruition.
Right.
Forge Park and the other one, which would be what's the other industrial
South
park?
Franklin Industrial Park. I don't know if it has a more formal name than that, where EMC is currently located.
King
right
Street Industrial
King Street,
Park.
Union Street area.
Yeah, so we issued a lot of permits to a lot of properties.
And I'm actually particularly curious to ask about Forge Park, because my understanding is that Forge Park involved the sale of a lot of state land. That whole side of town, I think, up until up north of where the current limit of the state forest is, right up to the road, 140, was, I think, state land. If I looked at one of the old maps correctly, I might be totally off base about that. So maybe it was private land that was sold. But
to the best of my knowledge, there was not any or a lot of state land sold. I don't think there was.
And what kicked off, I mean, naturally, the industrial parks were probably a big part of it. What kicked off that other really big wave of building in the early to mid 1990s? Why not, the 70s or the 80s? 70s had stagflation and maybe, some ups and downs in the economy, but Massachusetts did pretty well, is my understanding, in a lot of the 70s and 80s, thanks to defense and early computing and technology industries.
I think it was the same thing that was at work in the very late 50s and early 60s in the residential. It's that Franklin was a nice place to be. The land was a tad cheaper than, say, Norwood or Westwood. And the commercial and industrial land was available. We also had these two industrial park developers who were really pushing to get their properties rezoned. So it was a confluence of events.
And so after serving as Franklin's building commissioner, did you retire at that point, or did you go and work as a building commissioner elsewhere?
No, I left Franklin to pursue some writing. And I figured that by becoming a school teacher, I would have more time off. And that was when I found out that teachers do work in the summertime. But I did get some writing in. I got a lot of writing in. But I taught the building trades for 6 years. And from that point, because of a few situations in my family, I took an early retirement. I hung around the house for 3 months, and I said, I got to do something. This is not good for me. And I've been working for a person for over 20 years now. His name is Mark Trivet. He and I started together in Norton, and then he moved to Easton, and I followed him to Easton, and it's been a tremendous journey. And as I think I mentioned it to you before I went on the air. Did I talk about the third-party stuff on the air already?
You mentioned a little bit about that, but not for our viewers. So it'd be very interesting, I'm sure, for them to hear about some of the work you do these days.
For the last dozen or 15 years, I've worked 18 hours a week in Easton as a building inspector, and I also do what's called third party, and I've gone all over the state. I just finished a job in Hingham, a 7-story, 110-unit building, residential building. I did some work at the power plant addition in Sandwich, large addition, and in 1999, a building inspector friend, Bill Caspara, said to me, "You work mornings in Norton and Easton?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What do you do in the afternoon?" I said, "Not much. Would you like to be the inspector at Gillette Stadium?" In those days, it was CMGI Field. In fact, I still have a jacket at home that says CMGI Field on it. And I said, "I'd love to." So I got to inspect the Gillette Stadium from the first day, when nobody but a couple of surveyors were there with stakes and hammers, till the very end after the building was completed. And that was a magnificent experience.
That must have been really incredible. I'm forgetting, actually, the story with Gillette Stadium. Was there a preceding Foxborough Stadium that was there? Because I think the Pats have been there since late 80s sometime.
There was a big old stadium up. It would be in the front of the current stadium, up on the hill, more toward the south side, toward the westerly side. So the new stadium was the old stadium was up on the hill in front of the new stadium, And it's funny you mentioned that because a certain building inspector asked me 20 years ago, would you get a cement block for me and save it? And it's been in my mulch bed for 20 years. And Lauren keeps saying, does that guy want that block or not? And tell him to come and get it. I'll throw it in a dump. But I have a block there from the old stadium.
Might be worth something.
Yeah. So
give it to Tom Brady out at his next parade.
Interestingly enough, the first Super Bowl was led up to in the old stadium, and that playoff game against Oakland, where Vinatieri kicked the field goal in the snow, was in the old stadium. Yeah, because later that year they were still working on the new stadium, and they just put all the big screens in. And one day I'm working at the stadium inspecting, and all of a sudden I hear, yay! Well, they had put the Super Bowl up on the screen on the new stadium. But the new stadium hadn't been open yet. So that was a wonderful experience. Taught me a lot about curves in a big building. They're actually not curves. They look like they're curves on TV, but they're not. They're straight lines that are set off at angles.
Just kind of buttressed away from some kind of...
And they're far enough away that it looks like a curve. That kind of stuff. And one side of the stadium is on ledge, so it has no underneath like the south side. The craft paper business actually has its headquarters in the second floor of the new stadium.
Oh, no kidding. I didn't realize that.
On the south side, the side that faces the old racetrack.
Must make for a difficult commute every once in a while when they have a big midweek concert or something like that. Everyone's setting up for you.
So yeah, that was kind of the crowning achievement of my career, was the stadium. I learned a lot there. I learned a lot on a lot of other jobs, smaller jobs too. But I've been in inspection over 50 years, one way or another.
How has sort of building inspection changed down the years? Has it changed in a lot of ways, or is it more or less the same?
More complex. It's just like how the town of Franklin has grown. 55 years ago, somewhere in my basement, I have an old town of Franklin building code. And in those days, each town had its own code. There was no state building code in the 50s and 60s. The town of Franklin building code was 15 pages long. Today, the ICC, the International Code Council, writes 16 building codes. So, I mean, there are 16 books like yay thick with hundreds of pages.
Incredible.
For every page of the old Franklin building code. It's more complex, more complicated. Do more things. Energy conservation is...
Yes, that's a big one, I'm sure. I know one of the things that the town council adopted last year was a Green Communities Initiative, which obviously is very exciting for Franklin. It does have the potential drawback of raising the cost of building 10% because all the new insulation requirements and so forth add to the complexity of everything. And may, in some cases, like I understand Charles River Drive has had a lot of issues with buildings that are too tight, essentially. They have problems with walls that allow moisture in, but then too much insulation that traps it and often leads to moisture issues. One of those things that's kind of cropped up in light of new building techniques since the 80s, it seems.
You can build a building real tight, but you got to bring air in. And in the late 80s, I built a few houses with students up in Lexington, and we built them a lot tighter than even today's codes require, even though it's 25, 30 years ago. But we brought air. We brought air in. Bring in air and you temper it, warm it up a little bit, and use it as your air, because you have to have air. You can't build a house so tight that, and we've heard stories of people that can't light a fireplace. The house is so darn tight, a fire won't burn. So a lot of the new codes say that if you're going to put in a wood stove or a fireplace, you have to have adequate ventilation, or you have to bring in outside air to allow the stove to burn. California even has a code, Urban Wildlife Interface Code.
What exactly does that mean?
Urban Wildlife Interface Code. That means if you live in an urban or suburban area and there's all of these tremendous woods that can go up in flames afterward, you got to do certain things.
And when did the state actually adopt a statewide building code? Is that done federally in the U.S., or is that done by states, where each state kind of has its own building code?
It's done by state, and A year before I became building commissioner in Franklin, which would be 1974, that Massachusetts adopted the state building code, which after 30 or 40 years of going at it is very, very close to the ICC, which is International Code Council, and the IBC, which is the International Building Code. So the Mass Code and the IBC are very, very close, except for the administrative, because there are things in Mass state law that wouldn't work with using the ICC code or the IBC code. So administration is a little different, but all the rest of the code is pretty much similar.
And obviously, if you go way back to the start of your career here in town government in Franklin with planning board, when you folks were making a lot of these changes to zoning and changes to building code and stuff like that, what's sort of your take on zoning here in Franklin, and maybe even in a bigger picture here in Massachusetts?
Wow.
It's a big question.
It is a big question. The first thing I want to say is I don't even know how the governor's bill ended up last year in the recent session, but he had a bill in there. It was his proposal, and residentially, I agreed with most of it as far as multifamily housing, residential. But there was one thing in there that I've had a couple of your colleagues on the town council tell me, yes, they agree with me. It was quite wild, and that is, anybody who owns a single-family dwelling can build a second dwelling in their backyard for in-laws. The town I work in allows in-law apartments as a matter of right, up to 900 square feet, or no more than 25% of the floor area of the principal building. And I think that's right if a family wants to stay together. But to allow a second dwelling in the backyard, I'm not really big on that. But in general, there are a couple of other changes that in the governor's bill that I wasn't crazy about, and that would be that a special permit only had to be by a majority vote of a planning board. Right now it takes a 4/5 vote. And I think special permits are special, and they should require a special vote. So, but other than that, as far as the Franklin zoning, in most cases it's pretty good. There are a couple little glitches there that I think I'll be talking to the council about in the near future, but in general, I like the zoning, and I've worked together, sort of, in a way, with the town planner, Brian Taberner, on the Clark Cutler McDermott project. I like his approach to zoning. It's not high-handed or anything. It's everybody gets to look at it and gets to put their input, and I think Franklin is in the right direction. There was a situation last year where some folks wanted to have a few chickens, and the town went to work and managed to get something in. And I think if someone wants a couple of chickens on their property, they should have that right. So it's accommodating and it's accommodative, and I like that about it.
And I guess what's often very interesting is to look at how different zoning is from community to community. I've looked at Bellingham Zoning Map, which looks completely different than ours, because Franklin, it was a significant emphasis on rural residential, which sets larger lot sizes, probably a big factor in why Franklin never achieved the 70,000 people that it was projected to have in a report from 1975, looking at sort of a lot of Southgate-style developments everywhere. But there was more of a shift, I think, probably in the 80s. I don't know if this was already on the books, toward more of a rural residential, 1-acre lot type houses. Obviously, Franklin also has commercial, industrial, and a number of different residential categories. New things like the Mixed Business Innovation District for Clark Cutler McDermott, which we decided on as a council and as an economic development subcommittee with plenty of input from you. But it's very interesting to look at our neighbors. For instance, in the case of Bellingham, large chunks of the town are all industrial zoned or all agricultural zoned, and it's just fascinating to me to see how we differ from our neighbors in terms of zoning, and how each town kind of sets the tone of what its development will look like.
Right. In Franklin, everything pretty much goes back to the master plan of 1959 or 60. And at that point, we had some sewerage, but we didn't have sewerage as widespread as it is today. So at that point, we started with the downtown, and the closest lots to the downtown required 10,000 square feet, and as you radiated further outward, the lots got larger, 15,000, 20,000, 30, and up to 40,000 in the rural neighborhoods. And using that basis, you could still look at today's zoning map and find almost the same thing. I will note this, that in the original zoning master plan, there were 5 residential zoning districts and I believe 2 industrial and 2 commercial, which would be about 9 districts. Today we have almost twice that amount, but
wow.
the 9 original districts are still pretty much in there. And I think that's a good way to build things, is by adding and not by changing dramatically. So the town is well thought out, well zoned in my view. I know that we'd love to have more parking downtown. That's always a problem. There are a few other changes that we'd like to see. I for one, am not crazy about even though I own land and I live in a R5 district, I think the density of R5 zoning is too dense. We shouldn't be allowing 1 unit of housing for every 1,000 square feet of land. That could end up with some crazy results. I think it should be more like 3,000 to 4,000 feet. In the old days, by the way, the old zoning was, even in downtown, you could have three housing units for the first 15,000 square feet, 1 unit for every 3,000 feet thereafter. That's more reasonable. You set a minimum, and you build off of it. But that's what I would like to see happen.
Mm-hmm. And I guess one of the interesting things to think about is the folks that drew up the master plan in 1959, who are probably, for the most part, no longer with us, unfortunately. It'd be very interesting, I'm sure, to get their thoughts if they were still here to see Franklin 60 years later, if it turned out the way they expected from the master plan, if they anticipated how things might turn out, or if they'd be sort of surprised by how things have evolved since then.
Yeah, I wasn't quite on the master plan. That was about 6 years before me. But I'm surprised at how well things have turned out. From that little town of 7,500 people to, what, 34,000?
I think about 34,000 currently is the estimate.
34,000 people, wow, that's huge. That's like doubling and then doubling again. 7.5, 15, 30. It's still not enough. It's more than double. But yeah, I'm surprised at how it's turned out, and it pretty much fit the pattern of the master plan.
That's great that it actually turned out that way. And I guess, we have, if we were to scroll forward into the future 60 years, where do you think Franklin will be at moving forward? There's a lot of variables along the way, so it's very hard to project, but how do you think it's likely that Franklin will turn out, and how, I guess, the interesting question on top of that, how should Franklin turn out, in your view and in your years of experience as a building commissioner involved in town government and so forth?
As far as population numbers?
As far as population numbers or things that would be good to see the town evolve toward. I mean, we have a lot of great services today and great connection to our highway and to train tracks. Is there any ingredients that Franklin still needs to add, or things that the town should keep in mind as it moves forward?
The one big thing with me is our water supply. In the 80s, Town Administrator Paul Shue asked me we had no public works director at the moment this happened. And what happened was that the town needed to get some input as far as what was available for future well sites. And I was building commissioner at the time, and he said, would you tackle this? And I did, and we hired outside consultants. That was part of the plan, preordained. And at that point in 82, 83, 84, there were nearly 100 potential well sites. Today, I think there are probably 2 or 3 left.
Wow.
Or 4. So
incredible.
That's something that always needs a lot of watching, and our current wells have to be babied and maintained and treated properly, and got to make sure that the right uses go in there and that some use with hazardous waste or hazardous chemicals doesn't come in and wreck some. You know yourself, you can have the most the most unhazardous situation in the world, the quietest residential street. And theoretically, an oil truck could go down the street and tip over, and you'd have a calamity.
Absolutely.
And that kind of thing has to be constantly monitored. That's not something that never goes away.
And actually, an interesting factoid that I came across recently from the Department of Public Works, Franklin is actually the largest groundwater user of any community in Massachusetts.
Really?
It turns out the largest one that doesn't have some kind of river, reservoir, or pond that it draws from.
No fooling.
So we're basically in a kind of unusual situation because of that. We have pretty high iron and manganese levels because of the very ancient granite rock that all the water has to seep through before it comes to our wells, which we need to remediate, plus all kinds of impositions from the federal government in terms of clean water. Lots of concerns I know raised a few years ago at phosphorus levels from principally people putting fertilizer in their yards, which I know the EPA was saying the town would have to spend over $100 million to clean up over the course of about 20 years, and all kinds of other things like that, which certainly raise big questions about our water supply going forward. So I would agree that's definitely a big issue to think about in the years ahead.
The other thing about water supply, and I've noticed it, is that, say the old days, 50 years ago, if a town had 8 parts per million of sodium, or 10 ppm, that was, hey, we got to watch this, it's getting high. And in those days, the maximum allowed by the state was 20 parts per million. And today, every town, and I've known this from looking at Franklin and looking at Easton, looking at Foxborough, Mansfield, etc., all the towns are up in the 50, 60 parts per million of sodium. And what we're saying today is, well, maybe that's not so bad. In the old days, we used to say, oh, 20 parts per million is a lot. And today it's 35, 40, 50 parts per million isn't so bad. And I don't know if it isn't so bad. I would take their word for it that it isn't so bad, but it's a lot higher than it used to be.
Yeah, it's funny because we've in some ways become much more uptight, probably rightly so, about lots of other potential pollutants and elements in the water and stuff like that. You know, for instance, rightly so, iron and manganese, but seemingly less so. In some ways, we've dialed down the concern, like you're saying, about sodium, which obviously has gone up and gone up and gone up because there's more and more roads that all get salted every winter, and that runs off into the watershed. So it'll be very interesting to see how that pans out in the long run. And I'm actually not sure if there's any good ways to remediate that or filter it out. I imagine it must be hard because it's just little tiny ions going through, a filter, which has got to be difficult to deal with.
I have my own filter system, but I'm on the. I have a municipal service, but it's disconnected, and I have a well, artesian well. We put a well in 25 years ago, and we had it tested, and come to find out, extremely pure water. So we connected it up to the house. But I have a filter on that also, because when you have an artesian well, the turbulence down at the bottom of the well where the pump is brings up this. It depends on what color the bedrock is where your well is. Mine is gray. Brings up all these little pieces of gray grit. So if I didn't have the filter, I'd be getting gray grit in my drinking water. But it's really good water, and I think anybody can upgrade either a private well or municipal system with a filter. Well, and I'm not an expert at that.
Well, Paul, this has been excellent. We've had a chance to talk about all kinds of different evolutions Franklin's experienced in the past 60 years, many of them that you were involved with, both as selectman, planning board member, building commissioner, and all the great work you've done since then. So thank you so much for coming on the program today and sharing your insights with all of us.
I enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.